This question comes from a viewer who asks, why do we have phobias? That is, why do certain things scare us so much that we develop an intense fear of them? Phobias are an interesting topic because while it makes sense to be afraid of things that could hurt us, like spiders or heights, sometimes our fears get out of hand. In these cases, the things that we're afraid of aren't actually dangerous, but our brains react as if they were. So, what causes this extreme response? Well, let's get into it. All feelings and behaviors, including our fears and phobias, evolve over millions of years. And this means that there's usually a reason why we feel the way we do. So when it comes to phobias, they're essentially exaggerated versions of our fears, which in turn are more intense versions of our feelings. And feelings serve an important purpose. They help keep us alive. Feelings like anger and aggression help us compete for resources, while feelings like fear help us avoid danger. So, to answer our question, one reason why we have phobias is because they help us survive. But what about all the neutral or even positive feelings we have towards other things? Well, feelings aren't just about helping us survive. They also help us thrive. Feelings like trust and love help us form bonds with others. Feelings like contentment and happiness help us conserve energy when there's no immediate threat around. And feelings like interest and excitement help us explore new possibilities. This is why it's perfectly normal to have neutral or even positive feelings towards many things. But back to phobias. Another reason why we have phobias is because they are largely controlled by a part of our brain called the amygdala. The amygdala is an almond-shaped mass of neurons found in the temporal lobe of our brain, and it plays a big role in how we process fear. Now there are two of these masses, one in each half of the brain, and they receive input from almost every part of the brain. The amygdala then uses this input to determine whether something is threatening. If it is, then the amygdala will trigger the release of chemicals that cause an immediate physical reaction. For example, increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, sweating, and the release of stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline. These changes prepare our body to fight or flight, that is, to either confront whatever is making us afraid or run away from it. Now, it is important to point out that the amygdala doesn't decide whether or not something is actually dangerous. It just determines whether the input that it receives is threatening. So if you've had a negative experience with a spider, then your amygdala might start triggering the fight or flight response whenever you see one, even if the spider is actually harmless. This is because your amygdala has associated the thing that you learned to be afraid of, that is the spider, with being potentially dangerous. And when the amygdala does this, it stores the association in a part of the brain called the hippocampus. This is why phobias are considered to be learned experiences. That is, they're developed through conditioning. And here's where things can get really complicated. Sometimes phobias can be triggered by a single traumatic event. Like let's say you were bitten by a dog when you were young. In this case, your amygdala would quickly associate dogs with being dangerous and start triggering the fight or flight response whenever you saw one. But in most cases, phobias are triggered by a series of events, both positive and negative. And this is where things get tricky because in order for the amygdala to store the association of a neutral object being dangerous, that object needs to be paired with some kind of aversive stimulus. For example, let's say you grew up with a dog. You might associate dogs with positive things like playing and going for walks. But if you were ever bitten by a dog or saw one attack someone else, then you might start to feel uneasy around them. Over time, this feeling might become a full-blown phobia if you continue to be exposed to situations where dogs are present and the amygdala continues to pair them with aversive stimuli. Another thing that can happen is that our past experiences can influence how we interpret ambiguous situations. For example, let us say you've never been bitten by a dog, but you've heard a lot of stories about them attacking people. If you see a dog acting aggressively, like growling or baring its teeth, you might feel uneasy because you don't know whether or not it's actually dangerous. In this case, the ambiguity of the situation causes your amygdala to take over and trigger the fight or flight response just in case. But if you've had a lot of negative experiences with dogs, then this response might be much stronger. Now it is worth pointing out that we don't always need to have an obvious negative experience for a phobia to develop. Sometimes just seeing other people react to something in a certain way can be enough. This is called observational learning, and it's a big part of how we develop social phobias. For example, let's say you see someone else getting bitten by a dog. Even if you weren't directly harmed, you might still develop a phobia of dogs because you observed someone else being harmed. Finally, another reason why we have phobias is because they can be genetic. Several studies have found links between certain genes and specific phobias. For example, a 2016 study published in the Journal of Psychiatric Research found that a genetic variant called RS7916318 was associated with a higher risk of developing arachnophobia. This means that some people might be more predisposed to developing phobias than others. So now you know why we have phobias. They help us survive by exaggerating the potential dangers of certain things. But this begs the question, how do we treat them? Well, there are several ways to treat phobias, but they all involve somehow turning off the amygdala's threat response. One way to do this is through exposure therapy, which involves gradually exposing the patient to the thing that they're afraid of in a safe environment. By doing this, the patient learns that the thing they're afraid of isn't actually dangerous, and the amygdala stops associating it with being threatened. Another way to treat phobias is through medication. Certain medications like SSRIs and SNRIs can help reduce the severity of phobias by increasing the levels of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. These neurotransmitters help regulate the amygdala's response to fear. Finally, there are alternative treatments like hypnosis and biofeedback, which can also help reduce the severity of phobias. Now, while phobias can be very distressing, it's important to remember that they serve an important purpose. They help keep us safe from potential danger. That is why it is only when phobias get in the way of our daily lives that they become a problem. And luckily, there are effective treatments available to help people with phobias learn to control their symptoms. As always, I want to thank my supporters for helping me make this video. And I want to give a special shout out to today's supporter, Catherine, who asks, "What does your research assistant do?" My research assistant, Annie, helps me find and watch all of the videos that I'm referencing. She also helps me organize my notes and write the scripts for my videos. And finally, she edits my videos before I upload them. Basically, I couldn't do any of this without her. So thanks, Annie. If you would like to ask me a question, you can do so through the comments section. And if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. As always, thanks for watching.